Hello and welcome to our Soul After Death book club. Tonight we are going to be talking about out of body experiences and the occult. And so last week, we actually 2 weeks ago, we finished up on the toll houses. We went through the examples of some of the lives of the saints and the implications for the after death experiences that we've been studying. So, with that in mind, tonight we are going to be talking about out of body experiences and how they're discussed in occult literature. And this is a really long chapter, actually. So I'm going to break it up into two parts, and then I'm actually going to have the last 5 pages or so, which are about reincarnation. I'm going to do a separate thing on Freed Indeed Live. So if you want to access that, just watch it on Freed Indeed Live. It doesn't quite fit with our book club, so I have to skip it for that. So, as far as out of body experiences in occult literature, um, Father Seraphim kind of explains why we're studying this on page 88. He says, researchers in today's after death experiences almost invariably turn for elucidation of these experiences to that form of literature which claims to be based on the experiences of the out of body realm. The occult literature down the ages, from the Egyptian and Tibetan books of the dead to the occult teachers and experimenters of our own day. Hardly any of these researchers, on the other hand, pay very serious attention to the Christian teaching of life after death or to the scriptural or patristic sources on which it is based. Why might this be? The reason is very simple. The Christian teaching comes from God's revelation to man of the fate of the soul after death and emphasizes chiefly the ultimate state of the soul in heaven or hell. While there is also abundant Christian literature describing what happens to the soul after death based on first-hand and after-death out-of-body experiences as presented in the chapter above on the toll houses, this literature definitely occupies a secondary place when compared with the primary Christian teaching on the soul's final state. The literature based on Christian experience is chiefly useful in elucidating and making more vivid the basic points of Christian doctrine. In the occult literature, however, exactly the opposite is the case. The chief emphasis is on the soul's experience in the out of body realm, while the ultimate state of the soul is usually left vague or open to personal opinions and guesses. So, he goes on to say, today's researchers are much more easily attracted to the experiences of occult writers, which seem to be capable of at least a degree of quote unquote scientific investigation, than to the teachings of Christianity, which requires commitment to faith and trust in the leading of a spiritual life in accordance with it. So, these occult texts really they're being explored by these people because of a faulty methodology. So their methodology is really that they want to approach the topic from a place of what they already are in agreement with. They don't want to explore orthodox texts because they don't agree, frankly. So we have the responsibility, though, to take in all of the evidence. We have no fellowship with the works of darkness, but we do expose the works of darkness, and we have to understand these texts in order to refute them. So that's why Father Seraphim going through these occult texts is important, even if they make us a little bit uncomfortable. So to begin with, he actually goes from here to a discussion of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, and I understand why he does that, but I'm actually going to start with talking about the Egyptian Book of the Dead first. The Egyptian Book of the Dead has historically been a lot less accessible to modern researchers. It's a little bit more accessible to us now, but in the after death literature, they don't reference the Egyptian Book of the Dead all that much. And there's a couple of different reasons for that, which we'll talk about in a minute. But the Egyptian Book of the Dead was actually very influential in the ancient world and was the sacred text of the Egyptian mystery religion. So it was a very important text historically. But I think a big part of the reason why it's not the text that's used by the researchers of today is because it actually presents the afterlife as being very perilous. The afterlife in the Egyptian Book of the Dead is largely a continuation of this life, but there's a lot of very dangerous things that people have to contend with. For example, there's one of the Egyptian gods is this big dog who it has an alligator head, and if you're a bad person, then the dog just eats you. Um, so not a great way to end your story, but the point is that the Egyptian Book of the Dead does not really fit the narrative of after death studies people very well. So I think that's a big part of why it's not examined. Another thing that makes it difficult to study the Egyptian Book of the Dead is that the Egyptian religion no longer exists. They all converted to Christianity and became the Coptic Orthodox Church. So in other words, there's no modern readers. Modern readers can only guess at the symbols and all of these things in the Egyptian Book of the Dead. We have no tradition that can interpret it for us. There's no living tradition of people who have learned from antiquity what was actually believed in the Egyptian mystery cult. So as a result, there's really no way to completely understand the Egyptian Book of the Dead. And the truth is that even scholars who do study the Egyptian Book of the Dead say that it presents kind of a self-contradictory view in multiple places. It's very confused and disjointed. So in all likelihood, the Egyptian Book of the Dead was meant to be something more like a liturgical text for the Egyptian mystery religion and can only be understood in that context. It's probably not meant to be something that you just pick up and read, but there's nobody continuing on that liturgy, which is awesome for horror writers because we can make the ancient Egyptian mystery religion say whatever we want it to say and make it super creepy and weird. But the reality is that for Egyptologists, pretty difficult to make a study of that. Now, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, on the other hand, or the Tibetan Bod, is a little bit different than that. For one thing, the Tibetan Book of the Dead actually has a lot more similarity with the Orthodox worldview and has a lot more similarity with the worldview behind the after death studies people. So, for a lot of reasons, the Tibetan Book of the Dead actually is much more worthy of study from the perspective of these folks. And I'll just read what Father Seraphim has to say. He says, the Tibetan Book of the Dead is an 8th century Buddhist book, which probably hands down pre-Buddhist traditions from a much earlier period. Its Tibetan title is The Liberation by Hearing on the After-Death Plane. And it is described by the English editor as a mystic manual for guidance through the other world of many illusions and realms. It is read at the body of the newly deceased for the benefit of the soul, because, as the text itself says, during the moments of death, the various misleading illusions occur. That's from page 151 of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. These, as the editors note, are not visions of reality, but are nothing more than one's own intellectual impulses which have assumed a personified form. In later stages of the 49 days of the after-death experience described in the Tibetan Bod, there are visions of both peaceful and wrathful deities, all of which, in accordance with Buddhist doctrine, are regarded as illusions. The end of this whole process is the final fall of the soul into reincarnation, which in Buddhist teaching is an evil that is to be avoided through Buddhist training. Both books give one a sickening impression of the utter insanity and banality of communications from the spirit world. So the Tibetan Book of the Dead actually does have quite a bit of truth in it, but it also has a lot of erroneous teachings in it, and a lot of it is presented as something that as visions of the afterlife had during out-of-body experiences. To make a brief note, the Tibetan Book of the Dead claims that its visions are illusory. However, I think this word gets misunderstood a lot by people who try to study this topic. In Buddhism, they believe that all of life is illusory. So they believe that everything we experience is really kind of an illusion. This is a doctrine they have called Maya, which comes from Hinduism. And in Hinduism, they believe that everything is more or less illusory, and that we are actually part of sort of one whole organism that is the universe. So in that sense, everything is illusory. So we shouldn't misunderstand what they mean when they say illusory. They don't mean that what these people experienced isn't real any more than what we experience in our day-to-day life isn't real. Now, some Buddhists will say that what we experience in our day-to-day life actually isn't real. But my point is that in the same way that our day-to-day lives are real, what these people experienced is real in that sense, even though they believe that it's illusory. I know it's confusing, but hey, that's why I'm not Buddhist. So there's some similarities between the Tibetan Book of the Dead and the Egyptian Book of the Dead, or the T-Bod and the E-Bod, but one of the biggest differences is that the T-Bod has a modern tradition associated with it. There are still Buddhists who have handed down the teachings and practices associated with this text throughout the centuries, and therefore this is a text that modern scholars can actually study in conjunction with modern people who are in a real tradition, and therefore it's a book that's much more easily accessible and understandable. Again, though Buddhism does teach this doctrine of Maya, and so therefore when they say that the visions are illusory, they don't mean imaginary. Now, I do have a whole video that I've done on reincarnation. Father Seraphim mentions reincarnation in passing here and says that we're going to talk about that more later. At the end of this chapter, it goes into the doctrine of reincarnation, and I'm going to actually do a presentation on the end of this chapter, but on Freed Indeed Live. Whereas I have done a video called Is Reincarnation True? Or Persuasion on Reincarnation. I highly recommend going back and watching that to learn more about reincarnation and why Orthodox Christians reject the teaching of reincarnation. But what we need to know here is that reincarnation is a very central aspect of the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And like Father Seraphim pointed out, it's seen as a problem that is to be avoided, and it can only be avoided through knowing the tenets of Buddhism and being trained in it and all this. So at the end, when we do that video on reincarnation, we'll talk about why reincarnation is false. But in the meantime, it's good to know that reincarnation is super important to the Book of the Dead and its teachings, which I bring that up only because I think that actually gets lost a little bit in some of these after-death researchers' books. I don't think they're really taking into full account how much of the T-Bod is all about the avoidance of the avoidance or falling into reincarnation, because that does go against their preconceived idea, or at least it seems to. So there are, however, two striking similarities between the T-Bod and modern experiences of the afterlife. Those two experiences are a similarity of visions in both cases, between, say, the works of Raymond Moody and the Tibetan Book of the Dead. We see some very similar kind of out-of-body visions. And there's also, in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, it talks a lot about a light, which the modern researchers associate with their being of light. So as far as the similarity of visions, they basically have the same view of those first moments after death, which, as we may recall, in our first discussion, we talked about the fact that those actually are very similar to how we perceive the early moments of death in Orthodoxy. So in this, the Tibetan Book of the Dead and the Orthodox Church and these parapsychological researchers are all in agreement. But the after death people are associating the what the Tibetan Book of the Dead calls a quote unquote primary clear light. They identify this with the being of light. Now, I'm going to be honest, I don't really know to what extent these two things are compatible, because it does not seem like the Tibetan Book of the Dead is necessarily giving as much personification to the light as to be a being of light. But I will leave that to Buddhists and people who've really studied the Tibetan Book of the Dead a lot better than I have to come to a conclusion about whether or not it is the being of light. But the point is that we saw a couple of weeks ago that the being of light is actually a demonic experience. Satan himself masquerades as an angel of light, according to 2 Corinthians 11:14. And we saw that this being of light in the literature of today is, as a matter of fact, demonic in nature, and we saw lots of reasons why that is. Now, in the Orthodox Church, we don't doubt that these experiences happened. We don't doubt that the Tibetan Book of the Dead is recounting real experiences that people had. For the same reason why we don't doubt that seances and mediums are having real experiences. However, we also don't trust these visions and experiences. We don't put any stock in it because we know that the entities they're communicating with and interacting with are, in fact, demonic in nature. So we have no reason to trust that they're giving these people good information on the whole. Now, We also should remember that demons probably know who will come back. I'm not saying that demons are sending people back. Only God can determine the days of our life. However, demons do have a lot more knowledge and a lot more discernment than you and I have. And I would not be surprised at all to find out that demons are pretty capable of knowing who is going to actually die versus who is going to end up coming back. And since demons love to lead people into prelist, it should not surprise us at all if those same demons are, as a matter of fact, causing people to have experiences of the afterlife that are false. So now, excuse me, we get into the writings of Emanuel Swedenborg. And he says that resistance is futile because you will be assimilated if you're Swedish. Sorry, that's a Star Trek joke. But Emanuel Swedenborg, the reason why we're going to go into his writings is because he was very influential in the occult in his day. But now we're getting out of the ancient works and getting into more modern works that are much more understandable for modern audiences. But I would actually contend that Swedenborg is a lot more dangerous because the problem is that he's actually rooted in nothing. At least Buddhism has thousands of years of tradition that it's working with and kind of moving in. So even if I disagree with a lot of Buddhism's conclusions on different things, I can at least say that they have these thousands of years and they're rooted in something deeper, something perhaps more mystical or whatever, but they're still rooted in something. Swedenborg, he's just some guy. So his works are more modern, much more accessible than, say, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, but I think also much more dangerous because he is not drawing from any tradition. He's just doing whatever he wants, taking whatever he likes from various sources, and having his own visions, which I don't know what spurred on those visions, but I'm not going to speculate about it. Anyway, Father Seraphim says, another of the occult texts which contemporary researchers are investigating holds more hope for being understood, for it is from our own modern times and is thoroughly Western in its mentality and purports to be Christian. The writings of Swedish visionary Emanuel Swedenborg from 1688 to 1722 describe the visions of another world which began to appear to him in midlife. Before the visions began, he was a typical intellectual of the 18th century in Europe, fluent in many languages, a scholar and a scientist, an inventor, and a man active in public life as an overseer of Sweden's mining industries, and a member of the House of Nobles. In short, he was a universal man in the early age of science when it was still possible for one man to master almost all the knowledge of his day. He wrote some 150 scientific works, some of which, such as his 4-volume anatomical treatise, The Brain, were actually far ahead of his time. But then, in the 56th year of his life, he turned his attention to the invisible world, and in the last 25 years of his life, produced an immense number of religious works describing heaven, hell, angels, spirits, and all of these are based on his own personal experiences and visions. So, I'm not going to read all of Swedenborg's visions. I'm not even really going to go into a lot of detail. Swedenborg's visions, though, if you do read them, you'll find that they are very earthly. They first off, he describes this midpoint between heaven and hell. And then in this midpoint He describes gardens and parks and all kinds of things that basically sound just like life here on Earth. And then he interestingly talks about how after death, you're taught by your friends. So all your friends who have died before you come and they teach you all the things that you were missing out on and all the things you were confused about. Although interestingly enough, as we're about to see, they apparently aren't very good teachers, because in Swedenborg's visions of heaven, everybody is still confused. And we're going to get into that in a second. So, Swedenborg's visions of heaven are honestly kind of funny to me. We'll go through, we'll actually read Father Seraphim's quotations here. He says, "In this intermediate world of spirits, one is prepared for heaven in a process of education that takes anywhere from a few days to a year. But heaven itself so Swedenborg himself has some toll houses. I never noticed that before. He's got the toll houses there but it's just very different from us, right? So you're getting educated by your friends in the toll houses, and it's just a great time, man. It's just anyway. But heaven itself is described by Swedenborg as being not too different from the world of spirits, and both are very similar to Earth, page 171. There are courtyards and halls on Earth, as on Earth, and there are parks and gardens, houses and bedrooms for angels, where they have many changes of clothing. There are also governments and laws and law courts. Why do they need courts? Are there a lot of people doing illegal stuff?
Jaywalking. It's chaos.
It's just chaos. It's there goes the neighbor. There are governments, laws, and law courts, but all of these are, of course, more spiritual than on Earth, whatever that means. There are also church buildings where they house church services, and in these church services, clergymen who give sermons, and the clergymen become confused if anyone in the congregation disagrees with them. There are also marriages, schools, the raising and education of children, and public life. In short, anything that is found on earth can become spiritual in heaven. Swedenborg himself talked with many of the angels in heaven, all of whom he believed were only the souls of the dead, as well as with strange inhabitants of Mercury, Jupiter, and other planets. We're actually going to talk about that in a minute, but he talks with people from Mercury and Jupiter and other planets. And then he talked with Martin Luther in heaven and converted him to his own beliefs. However, he was not able to persuade John Calvin out of his belief in predestination. Hell, however, is described as a similarly earth-like place where the inhabitants are characterized by self-love and evil actions. So, Swedenborg's vision of heaven sounds awfully suspiciously like it's just Earth. But when you actually stop and think about his visions of heaven, they make no sense. Why are there ministers preaching sermons in heaven where everybody should theoretically know God because they're in heaven? What need do these people have of hearing sermons when they're in the presence of God? And then he says that people disagree with one another about God. Well, how are they disagreeing with one another if God is supposedly right there? Another problem is, why are there still denominations and disagreements? He talks about Martin Luther being in heaven. I won't make a comment about that. But Martin Luther is supposedly in heaven, but Swedenborg shows up and is able to convert Martin Luther. So there's conversions happening in heaven. But John Calvin doesn't convert out of Calvinism. So what's up with that? Why is John Calvin believing something totally different than what the other people in heaven are believing. These things simply make no sense. But weirdly, I want to key in on something that's bizarrely similar between Emanuel Swedenborg and Ellen G. White, the false prophet of Seventh-day Adventists. Ellen G. White and Emanuel Swedenborg actually have weirdly similar visions. For example, Ellen G. White also has visions of heaven, although she would say that it's the new earth, and her visions are also extremely earthly. But even more important, Ellen White also believed that she spoke with little green men from Mercury and Jupiter. Well, she didn't describe them as little green men. She actually described them as being rather large, which, of course, I mean, Jupiter is a big planet. So, you know, and according to Ellen White, Enoch actually lives on one of the other planets, and he's just chilling up there, you know, hanging out with the Martian ladies. Just like oh, what's that book where the Confederate guy goes to Mars and becomes a super soldier or something? Um, John Carter. Enoch is basically John Carter in Ellen White's story. So I guess false prophets flock together. But more importantly, another thing that draws Ellen G. White and Emanuel Swedenborg together is the fact that they drew away many people through external proofs. So, for example, Immanuel Kant, who was a philosopher and contemporary of Emanuel Swedenborg, said that Swedenborg was proven to be clairvoyant through many great and irrefutable proofs. So Immanuel Kant definitely believed that Swedenborg was clairvoyant, and that he could prove this. There was also the American philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson, who referred to Emanuel Swedenborg as a mastodon of literature and as the representative man. So, in the same way, this is something we see of a lot of these false prophets. They have demonstrations of supernatural abilities with which they lead people astray. Ellen G. White did a lot of the same things in the context of Seventh-day Adventism. There's stories of Ellen G. White holding up a Bible that was 45 pounds, and she held it up over her head during the preaching of a sermon, and she was able to do this for apparently a number of hours. And then some guy who was a bodybuilder or something came and picked up the same Bible and was only able to hold it up over his head for 20 minutes. And this is supposed to prove that Ellen G. White was in fact moved by the Holy Spirit, because it's not like demons could pick up a 45-pound object. That's
what it really means is that that dude, the bodybuilder, just did shoulders that day.
right.
It's like I couldn't even pick up my cell phone for 10 minutes after doing shoulders. You know?
That's right. Exactly. He was just exactly. That's the problem. But another similarity is that both Ellen White and Emanuel Swedenborg contain a lot of occult references in their texts. For example, both of them refer to spirit guides. Both of them refer to these earthy visions of the spiritual realm. Both of them have talismans. Ellen G. White had a green cord. I actually don't know if Emanuel Swedenborg, now that I'm thinking about it, I don't know for sure if he had a talisman. So somebody who studied him more can tell me in the comments. Did he have a talisman? Ellen White had a green cord that she could use to summon her spirit guide.
No.
Yeah, she did.
And she's a Christian?
Well, no, but she's...
She's a self...
Yeah, she claims to be a Christian,
yeah,
but she said that her... Right, exactly. She said that her spirit guide came and gave her a little green cord, and that she could tug on it and he would appear.
She's tugging on some spirit's cord.
That's right.
Weird.
That's right, exactly. She be all tugging that spirit cord. Yeah. No, I mean, it's actually really fascinating when you read these texts and then when you have knowledge of the occult and you see just the bizarre connections to these things, and just the fact that, I mean, if you're Seventh Day Adventist and you're watching this, I'm sorry if you feel made fun of. I really don't want to make fun of you. But on a serious note, please point out to me any example in Scripture where the prophets needed a spirit guide or a talisman to summon a spirit guide. And if you can find one, I would be delighted to discuss it with you. So, Father Seraphim says, today, of course, the revival of interest in occultism has brought him, that's Emanuel Swedenborg, to the fore as a mystic and seer, not bound by doctrinal Christianity. And in particular, researchers in after-death experiences find remarkable parallels between their findings and his description of the first moments after death. There can be little doubt that Swedenborg was in actual contact with invisible spirits and that he received his revelations from them. An examination of how he received these revelations will show us what is the actual realm these spirits inhabit. And the basic answer is that he was doing occult rituals. So Father Seraphim continues, the history of Swedenborg's contact with the invisible spirits, which he recorded in great detail in his voluminous journal of dreams and spiritual journal, reveal precisely the characteristics of one entering into contact with demons, as described by Bishop Ignatius. From childhood, Swedenborg practiced a form of meditation involving relaxation and intense concentration. In time, he began to see a splendid flame during these meditations, which he accepted with trust and interpreted as a sign of approval of his ideas. This prepared him for the opening up of communication with the realm of the spirits. Later, he began to have dreams of Christ and received into society of the immortals. And he gradually became aware of the presence of spirits all around him. Finally, the spirits began to appear to him even while awake. The first of these latter experiences occurred when he was traveling in London. Well, to be fair, London is pretty haunted, so I can imagine you be running into spirits all the time over there. But one night, after overeating, he suddenly saw a blackness and crawling reptiles on the floor, and then a man sitting in the corner of the room who said, "Eat not so much," and then disappeared into the blackness. Although he was frightened at this apparition, he trusted it as something good because it gave him moral advice. Then, as he himself relates, during the same night, the same man revealed himself to me again, but I was not frightened now. He then said that he was the Lord God, the creator of the world and the Redeemer, and that he had chosen me to explain to men the spiritual sense of Scripture, and that he himself would explain to me what I should write on the subject. That the same night were opened to me so that I became thoroughly convinced of their reality in the worlds of spirits, heaven and hell. Afterward, the Lord opened daily, very often, my bodily eyes, so that in the middle of the day I could see the other world, and in a state of perfect wakefulness converse with angels and with spirits. So again, this is just manifestly demonic. I think anyone with even a remote familiarity with um, any Christian texts and any Christian teachings regarding demonology and these sorts of things knows what's happening here. This is a textbook case of prelist. It's a textbook case of demonic deception and of straight up communion with aerial spirits. So we can see all of this. Unfortunately, Emanuel Swedenborg was not able to see the danger that he was in, and he continued communing with these things. And we recall that prelist is when demons use false visions, sometimes imitating Christ or even the saints, and they want us to think that we are doing good when we're actually following them. So this is one of the great dangers according to Orthodox spirituality. And we note that no one is totally immune. Even Orthodox people can fall into prelist. And in fact, to some extent, we all are often guilty of some degree of prelist. But we have to be on guard against these things and be following the fathers and be striving after Christ and be attentive to these things so that we can fight against our basically fight against our natural urge to fall into prelist. But people like Swedenborg, trusting in their own devices, have no defense against prelist, and there's really no way for them to stop themselves from falling into prelist. Similar to Swedenborg, we get into the realm of theosophy. Theosophy sees the afterlife as very earthy in the same way that he does. But theosophy is a little bit different. So theosophy actually builds on the writings of Swedenborg by discussing the astral plane as being divided into I think it's 7 realms. So they have 7 different realms. Maybe those realms represent 7 different toll houses. I don't know. But they believe that there's 7 realms that are described as a wonderful and peaceful place. In fact, they say that 9 out of 10 people who experience astral projection or out of body experiences don't want to come back. So, 9 out of 10, 90% of people are giving positive reviews to the astral realm, according to theosophy.
That's almost as good as like Crest toothpaste.
That's right, exactly.
9 out of 10 goodness.
That's right. Exactly. Exactly. No, you're good. No, don't. You're good. I love audience involvement. So, theosophy. Oh, sorry, we're on page 97 for those of you following at home. Theosophy, the invention of the Russian medium Helena Blavatsky. Blavatsky was founded in the late 19th century in an attempt to give a systematic explanation of the mediumistic contact with the dead, which had been multiplying in the Western world since the great outbreak of Spiritist phenomena in America in 1848. To this day, its teachings on the astral plane, although often not called by that name, is the standard one used by mediums and other dabblers in the occult to explain their experiences in the world of spirits. Although theosophical books on the astral plane are filled with the same sickening inanity and banality that Dr. Jung finds characterized in all spiritist literature, still behind this triviality, there is a basic underlying philosophy of the otherworld reality that strikes a responsive chord in researchers today. Today's humanistic worldview is much more favorably disposed to another world that is pleasant rather than painful, and that allows for gentle growth or evaluation rather than finality of judgment, and permits another chance to prepare oneself for a higher reality rather than determining one's eternal lot by one's behavior in earthly life. The teaching of Theosophy gives exactly these characteristics demanded by the modern soul, and its claims are based on experience or false visions. So, even though the terms have changed, the beliefs really haven't. Mediums are still using this same underlying philosophy that Madame Blavatsky came up with in her time. And she herself even saw this as another avenue of research. And if you want to know more about Theosophy, Dr. Michael Heiser has some great videos about Theosophy. But at the end of the day, Theosophy is kind of a source, trust me, bro, sort of religion. Madame Blavatsky claimed that she was in communication with these ascended masters who were informing her of her doctrines, but the thing is that only she was able to communicate with these ascended masters, so it's pretty much impossible for any of us to check her work or check her claims because we don't have access to the realm in which these ascended masters are um, are giving her these sources.
Will with enough LSD.
That's right. That's right. If you,
Or at least you'll think you are.
That's right.
You're running around with no pants.
Going into the portals.
Really just your neighbor's backyard.
That's right. So somebody sent me a thing where he was talking about how he had taken a whole bunch of shrooms and then like his girlfriend was chasing him down the street and he was in his underwear and then a cop car pulled up and he jumped into the cop car and was like, I don't know, it was a busy story, but his takeaway from that was that he was resistant to the spiritual knowledge that he was supposed to receive that night.
Okay. Yeah. That's what it was. Definitely wasn't, just being on drugs.
Right. Yeah, no. So next week we're going to study astral projection and we're going to talk about what astral travel is, and then like I said, I have on my slide that I was hoping we would talk about reincarnation, but I ended up deciding to pre-record a lecture about reincarnation last week, so I did that. So I'll see you guys next week, and we will continue our discussion on astral projection and the occult. Thank you very much for watching. Please do share this with your friends so that they too can be freed indeed. And it's even more important that you share right now because Facebook has me on their censorship. Facebook is attacking me with their censorship bureau, I should say. So I'm not able to share these to as many people as I would usually be able to. So yeah, it's even more important than ever that you guys help me out by sharing this so that your friends can be freed indeed. God bless.